You get a load of that guy's call sign. Lone Dolphin, what even is that? The words, sharp and laced with the casual cruelty of youth, cut through the low hum of the Fort Benning canteen. Private Jake Miller, barely 20 and convinced the world was his to conquer, gestured with his chin towards an old man sitting alone by the window. The man was slight, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and a face etched with the kind of deep lines that maps of long, hard roads possess. He ate his stew slowly, methodically, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the manicured lawns of the base. Miller's two companions, Privates Evans and Chun, snickered into their trays. They were fresh out of basic, their uniforms still stiff, their minds still programmed with the black and white certainty of the training field. To them, the world of the Army was a rigid hierarchy of strength and volume, and this quiet old man registered as a ghost and irrelevance. Seriously, Miller pressed on, his voice rising. Lone Dolphin. Sounds like a rejected cartoon character. Maybe he was in the Navy and got lost? Flipper, is that you? His imitation of a high-pitched dolphin call earned another round of sycophantic laughter. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't seem to hear them, or if he did, he gave no sign. This apparent weakness, this refusal to engage, was like fuel to Miller's fire. He saw it not as dignity, but as frailty, an invitation. Pushing his chair back with a loud scrape, Miller stood up, a smirk plastered on his face. "Watch this," he muttered to his friends. He sauntered over to the old man's table, his posture a deliberate, arrogant swagger. He stopped directly in front of the table, blocking the old man's view of the window. "Excuse me, sir," Miller began, his voice dripping with mock respect that was more insulting than any overt slur. The old man slowly lifted his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, but they held a depth that was momentarily unsettling. For a fraction of a second, Miller felt a flicker of doubt, a primal instinct warning him he was treading on sacred ground. He crushed it immediately. Weakness was a contagion, and he was immune. "My buddies and I over there," he said, hooking a thumb over his shoulder. "We couldn't help but overhear someone mention your old call sign. Lone Dolphin, we were just wondering what that was all about. You do tricks with a beach ball, balance a horn on your nose." The old man finished chewing a piece of carrot before he spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy with disuse, but steady. Something like that. The simple, non-committal answer was infuriating. Miller had expected a reaction, anger, embarrassment, anything but this placid calm. It felt like punching water. He decided to escalate, to force a response. "Because, you know, in the Army, we have real call signs. Reaper, Havoc, Wolverine, names that mean something. Names that command respect." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the now quiet nearby tables. "Lone Dolphin just sounds soft. Sad, even. Like you lost your pod." He straightened up, a triumphant grin on his face, playing to his audience. Several other young soldiers were watching now, some smirking, others looking down at their food, uncomfortable. Across the cavernous room, Master Sergeant Reyes, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun, watched the scene unfold. His fork was frozen halfway to his mouth, his jaw tight. He knew Miller was a hothead, all ego and no experience, but this was a new level of disrespect. His instinct was to storm over there and verbally flay the private down to the bone, but something held him back. It was the old man's posture. Reyes had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had been through hell and no longer had anything to prove. It was a stillness that was more powerful than any shout. The old man, Elias Vance, took a sip of water. He placed the glass down with a soft click. "Names are just words, son. It's the story behind them that gives them weight." Miller scoffed, a loud, obnoxious sound. "Oh, I'll bet it's a hell of a story. Did you rescue a rich kid's poodle from a swimming pool? Get a medal for it." He laughed, and this time, the laughter from his friends was weaker, tinged with nervousness. The atmosphere in the canteen had shifted. The initial amusement had evaporated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. They were no longer watching a joke. They were witnessing a public humiliation, and the victim's refusal to break was making the aggressor look more and more like a bully. "You should show some respect, Private," a voice called out from a few tables away. It was a young captain, his face grim. Miller shot him a defiant glare. I'm just asking a question, sir. Trying to learn from my elders. The sarcasm was thick enough to be cut with a knife. He turned back to Vance, his face hardening. The game was over. Now he just wanted to win, to break this old man's infuriating composure. So what is it, old-timer? What's the big, weighty story? Or is there nothing? Are you just some supply clerk who picked a stupid name and got stuck with it for 30 years? He slammed his hand flat on the table. The sharp crack made several people jump. Elias Vance didn't even blink. He simply looked at the young private's hand on his table, then back up at his furious, flushed face. He was about to speak, to perhaps end the confrontation with a quiet word, when a new presence made itself known. The side door to the canteen swung open, and in walked Colonel Davies, the base commander. He was a tall, imposing man who radiated an aura of absolute authority. The moment he stepped inside, the room fell into a cathedral-like silence. Every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking officer present, snapped to attention or sat ramrod straight in their chairs. All except Miller, who was still fixated on his target. "I'm talking to you," Miller hissed, his back to the colonel. Master Sergeant Reyes was already on his feet, his face a mask of thunder, about to intervene, but the colonel held up a single, almost imperceptible hand. He had seen enough. Colonel Davies walked with a measured, deliberate pace, his polished boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. He didn't stop at the captain's table or acknowledge Master Sergeant Reyes. He walked directly to the small table by the window. He ignored Private Miller completely, as if he were a piece of furniture. He stopped beside Elias Vance, clicked his heels together, and rendered the sharpest, most respectful salute of his career. "Sergeant Major Vance." The colonel's voice boomed, clear and resonant in the silent hall. "It is an absolute and profound honor to have you on my base, sir." The word "sir," from a full-bird colonel to a quiet old man in civilian clothes, was a sonic boom. It sent a shock wave through the room that physically jolted Miller. He spun around, his face a canvas of pure confusion. He saw the colonel, the silver eagle on his chest gleaming, holding a salute to the man he had just been tormenting. His brain couldn't process the input. It was like seeing the sky turn green. "Sir," Miller stammered, his arrogance instantly dissolving into a puddle of bewildered panic. The colonel slowly lowered his salute, but his eyes remained on Vance. "I hope you are finding the accommodations acceptable, Sergeant Major. Anything you need, you have but to ask." Elias Vance gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Everything is fine, Colonel. Thank you." Only then did Colonel Davies turn his head, his gaze falling upon Private Miller. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a glacial cold that was more terrifying than any rage. It was the look of a man who had seen combat, who had made life-or-death decisions, and who was now looking at something utterly contemptible. "Private," the colonel said, his voice dangerously soft. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The words wouldn't come. His entire world had been turned upside down in the span of 10 seconds. I was just talking to the man, sir," he finally managed, his voice a squeak. "Talking," the colonel repeated, taking a step closer. Miller flinched. "It looked to me like you were disrespecting a guest on my base. It looked to me like you were publicly humiliating a man to whom you, I, and every single person in this uniform owes a debt that can never be repaid." The colonel's voice began to rise, not in volume, but in intensity, each word a hammer blow of condemnation. "You stand there in a uniform you have not yet earned, puffed up with an arrogance you have no right to, and you mock his call sign?" Miller was pale, trembling. "Sir, I didn't know." "You didn't know," the colonel roared, and this time the sound echoed off the walls. "That is the entire point, Private. You know nothing. You walk past greatness and see only weakness. You hear a name and you understand nothing of its cost." He pointed a rigid finger at Elias Vance. "You want to know the story behind the name Lone Dolphin, Private? You feel you are entitled to that knowledge after the disgusting display you just put on?" The colonel didn't wait for an answer. He swept his gaze across the entire room, his eyes locking with every young soldier he could find. He was no longer just dressing down one man. He was delivering a lesson to a generation. This man was a Navy SEAL. The colonel began, his voice dropping again, taking on a storyteller's cadence, filled with reverence and sorrow. Back when it was a different kind of war. Dirtier. Quieter. His unit was designated Dolphin. They were inserted deep into enemy territory on a mission of critical importance. They were ambushed. Outnumbered 10-1. A bloody, brutal firefight on a jungle hillside that no one in the world was ever supposed to know about. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The entire canteen was frozen, every eye on the colonel and the quiet old man. His team was wiped out. Every single one of them. They fought to the last man, to the last bullet. And when the last of his brothers fell, he did not run. He did not surrender. He held his ground. Alone, the colonel's eyes found Miller's again, pinning him in place. For 72 hours, he held that hillside. He protected the bodies of his fallen comrades, refusing to let them be captured. He safeguarded the intelligence they had died to protect. He fought off wave after wave of enemy assaults, wounded, exhausted, and completely on his own. When the extraction team finally arrived, they found him collapsed over his radio, surrounded by the shells of his spent ammunition and the bodies of the enemy who had tried to take his hill. The colonel took a deep breath, his own voice thick with emotion. He was the only one who came home, the lone survivor of his unit. The Lone Dolphin, that name you found so amusing, isn't a joke, Private. It's a memorial. It's the burden he has carried every single day for the last 50 years. It's a testament to a level of courage and sacrifice you can't even begin to comprehend. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with a mixture of awe and profound, gut-wrenching shame. Miller looked as if he had been physically struck. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly white. His legs gave out, and he staggered back, collapsing into his chair. He stared at Elias Vance, at the quiet old man, and for the first time, he truly saw him. He saw the weight of the ghosts on his shoulders, the sorrow in his pale blue eyes, the incredible, unbreakable strength that held him upright. The call sign wasn't soft. It was the heaviest thing Miller had ever imagined. Evans and Chun were looking at the floor, their faces burning with humiliation. They, and every other young soldier who had snickered, felt the crushing weight of their own ignorance. Colonel Davies let the silence hang for another long moment before speaking again, his voice now cold and professional. "Master Sergeant Reyes," he commanded. Reyes stepped forward, his expression grim. "Sir, take these 3 privates to my office. They will wait for me there. Then, I want you to arrange a tour of the base memorial hall for every trainee in this canteen. It seems they are in desperate need of a history lesson." "Yes, sir," Reyes said, his voice tight. He grabbed Miller by the arm, hauling him to his feet. Miller stumbled, his eyes still locked on Vance, a silent, horrified apology in his gaze. As Reyes marched the 3 disgraced privates out of the canteen, Colonel Davies pulled up a chair and sat down at Elias Vance's table. "I am truly sorry you had to experience that, Sergeant Major," he said quietly. Vance simply shook his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "They're just kids, Colonel. They don't know any better. It's our job to make sure they learn," Davies replied firmly. Later that afternoon, Master Sergeant Reyes stood with Miller, Evans, and Chun in the hallowed quiet of the base's memorial hall. The air was cool and still, smelling of polished brass and old wood. The walls were lined with plaques, names upon names of soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Reyes didn't yell. He didn't need to. The shame radiating from the 3 young men was punishment enough. He led them to a bronze plaque in a quiet corner. It was newer than some of the others, dedicated in the late 1990s after the mission records were finally declassified. At the top, it read, Operation Silent Tide. Below it were 7 names. And at the bottom, a single, stark sentence, in memory of the brave men of SEAL Team Dolphin, who fell in service to their country. Sole survivor, Petty Officer Elias Vance. Miller read the names. Then he read them again. These weren't just names on a wall. They were the men behind the call sign. The pod that the Lone Dolphin had lost. He reached out a trembling hand, but stopped just short of touching the cold metal. He finally understood. It wasn't a name Vance had chosen. It was a name that had chosen him, branded onto his soul by fire and loss. "Respect," Reyes said, his voice a low rumble that filled the silent hall, "is not about how a man looks, or how old he is, or what you think his name means. It's about understanding that every person you meet has a story, and some stories were bought and paid for with a currency you can't even fathom." He let them stand there for a long time, soaking in the gravity of the place and the depth of their transgression. There was no formal punishment that could teach this lesson. The shame was the lesson. The next morning, the three privates, their uniforms impeccably pressed, stood waiting outside the base's guest quarters. They had been standing there since dawn. When Elias Vance finally emerged, dressed for his departure, Miller stepped forward, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on a point just over the old man's shoulder. He couldn't bring himself to meet his gaze. "Sir," Miller began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sergeant Major Vance. There are no words to express how ashamed I am of my actions yesterday. My disrespect was inexcusable. I had no right. I am sorry, sir. Truly sorry." Evans and Shin echoed his sentiments, their own apologies quiet and sincere. Elias Vance looked at the three young, humbled soldiers. He saw not the arrogant bullies from the canteen, but three boys who had been handed a hard, necessary lesson. He saw the future of the army they all served. He walked over to Miller and stopped in front of him. Slowly, he raised a hand, and for a terrifying moment, Miller thought the old man might strike him. He deserved it. Instead, Vance gently adjusted the collar of Miller's uniform, which was slightly askew. "The heaviest things we carry, son," Vance said, his voice the same quiet rasp as before, "are not our rucksacks. They are the names of the men we carry with us." He met Miller's eyes, and in their pale blue depths, there was no anger. There was only a profound sadness, and a flicker of something else, forgiveness. "Just do your best to be worthy of the uniform you wear." That's all they would have asked. He gave a final, small nod, and then walked past them towards the waiting car. Miller, Evans, and Chun stood frozen, watching him go. They didn't move until the car was out of sight, leaving them alone with the weight of his words and the unforgettable story of the lone dolphin.